Rwanda is a beautiful country right in the middle of Africa. They call it the land of 1,000 hills, and if you ever see a picture, you'll understand why. It's green, it's hilly, it's stunning. It sits there, a small but mighty nation, surrounded by bigger countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Tanzania, Uganda, and Burundi. This place has a story that is long, complex, and incredibly powerful. It's a story about people, power, and the amazing strength to rebuild. To really get what Rwanda is today, you have to go way, way back before the news crews and the headlines, to a time when its story was just beginning, written on the very hills that define its landscape. The first people to call this land home were the TWA. They were hunter-gatherers, living in the forests for thousands of years, in harmony with the nature around them. They knew the land like the back of their hand. Then a bit later came the Hutu people. They were farmers, and they were really good at it. They settled down and started growing crops, building communities and villages. They were the majority of the population and formed the backbone of the early society. These two groups lived together, creating the initial foundation of what would become the Rwandan culture we know today. After the Hutu, the Tutsi people arrived. The Tutsi were pastoralists, which is a fancy word for people who raise cattle. Cattle were a huge deal back then. They were like a walking bank account. The more cows you had, the more wealth and status you possessed. Over time, these three groups, the TWA, Hutu, and Tutsi, started to mix. They spoke the same language, Kinyarwanda, and shared the same culture and beliefs. They weren't seen as totally separate tribes, but more like different social classes based on what they did for a living. You could even move between groups. A Hutu who got a lot of cows could become a Tutsi. This mix of people eventually organized themselves into a powerful kingdom, the Kingdom of Rwanda. This kingdom was led by a king called the Mwami, who was almost always Tutsi. The Mwami was seen as a divine ruler, a figure of great power and respect who held the kingdom together. He had chiefs under him who helped manage the land and the people. For hundreds of years this kingdom thrived. It had a clear structure, a shared culture, and a system that for the most part worked for everyone living on those 1,000 hills. It was a complex society with its own politics and traditions long before any outsiders showed up. So for centuries, Rwanda had its own thing going, a kingdom, a king, a system. But then in the late 1800s, everything started to change. Europeans arrived in Africa, carving up the continent like it was a giant birthday cake, and they didn't bring any presents. First came the Germans. They looked at Rwanda and said, "Yep, this looks like a nice spot, it's ours now." They became the colonial rulers, the new bosses in town. The Germans didn't really change the local power structure much. They just ruled through the existing Tutsi king, the Mwami, letting him handle the day-to-day stuff while they took charge from the top. After Germany lost World War I, the Belgians took over. And let me tell you, the Belgians didn't just sit back. They were very, very hands-on, and not in a good way. They became obsessed with the differences between Hutu and Tutsi. They had this crazy idea, based on very bad science, that the Tutsi were a superior race. They measured people's noses, their height, everything. They said the Tutsis were media group, side-by-side portraits of Tutsi and Hutu individuals, photos highlighting facial differences at its stock at it distribute_equally, taller, had thinner noses, and were basically more European-like, which they believed made them natural-born leaders. This was, of course, complete nonsense, but it was dangerous nonsense. The Belgians took this flawed idea and turned it into law. In 1933, they introduced identity cards. Imagine this. Everyone had to carry a card that said Hutu, Tutsi, or TWA. Before you could move between groups, it was flexible. Now it was permanent. Your identity was stamped on a card, passed down from your father. If your dad was Hutu, you were Hutu. Forever. This simple piece of paper created a massive wall between people who had lived together for generations. It locked everyone into a box and basically told the Hutu majority that they were officially second-class citizens in their own country. This system created a lot of anger and resentment. The Belgians gave most of the power, education, and government jobs to the Tutsi minority. This wasn't fair, and the Hutu majority knew it. For decades, this tension just simmered under the surface. It was like a pot of water left on the stove, slowly getting hotter and hotter. The seeds of division, planted and watered by the colonial rulers, were starting to grow. The sense of being one people, one Rwandan identity, was being systematically torn apart, replaced by suspicion and hatred based on labels printed on a little card. When Rwanda finally gained independence from Belgium in 1962, the power flipped. The Hutu majority took control of the government. But the anger and division that the Belgians had created didn't just disappear. In fact, it got worse. Years of being treated as inferior had built up a huge amount of resentment. Now that they were in charge, some Hutu leaders used that same logic of division to target the Tutsi. There were waves of violence and discrimination against Tutsis, and many were forced to flee the country, becoming refugees in neighboring lands. The roles were reversed, but the hatred remained. This tension reached a boiling point in the early 1990s. The country was facing a lot of problems. The economy was bad and there was political pressure. A rebel army, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, formed mostly by Tutsi refugees who had fled earlier, started fighting to return to their country. The Hutu government used this as an excuse to ramp up the hate. They used radio stations and newspapers to spread propaganda, calling Tutsis cockroaches and snakes. They told ordinary Hutu people that the Tutsis were their enemy, that they were trying to take over and enslave them. They were preparing people for something truly awful. On April 6, 1994, the plane carrying Rwanda's Hutu president was shot down. No one knows for sure who did it, but Hutu extremists in the government immediately blamed the RPF. This was the trigger they were waiting for. Within hours, they set up roadblocks and started a campaign of pure evil, the genocide against the Tutsi. They gave lists of Tutsi families to militias called the Interahamwe. They went on the radio and told Hutu civilians to kill their Tutsi neighbors. It was organized, it was systematic, and it was horrifying. For 100 days, the world watched in horror and did almost nothing. In just over 3 months, almost 1 million people were murdered. Most were Tutsi, but many Hutu who refused to participate or who tried to help their neighbors were also killed. It was one of the darkest chapters in human history, a complete failure of humanity. The genocide finally ended in July 1994, when the RPF rebel army took control of the country. But by then, Rwanda was destroyed. The land was filled with graves, families were torn apart, and the trust between people was completely shattered. After the genocide, Rwanda was a nation in ruins. It was a place of ghosts and unimaginable pain. But what happened next is one of the most incredible stories of human resilience you will ever hear. The new government, led by the RPF, made a radical decision. They decided that the labels of Hutu and Tutsi had to go. They abolished the identity cards. The message was clear: from now on, you are not Hutu, you are not Tutsi, you are Rwandan. This was the first and most important step towards healing a country that had been ripped apart by those very words. The government's motto became Ubumwe, Umurimo, Gukunda Igihugu, which means unity, work, patriotism. This wasn't just a slogan, it became a plan for rebuilding the nation from the ashes. They focused on bringing people together, on creating a shared sense of purpose. They established community courts called Gakaka to bring justice to the millions of cases, allowing survivors to face the perpetrators in their own villages. This was messy and painful, but it was a crucial part of moving forward. At the same time, they focused on work, on rebuilding the economy, paving roads, and creating new opportunities for everyone. Today, if you visit Rwanda, especially the capital city, Kigali, you might be shocked. It is one of the cleanest, safest, and most organized cities in Africa. The economy has grown incredibly fast. They have put a huge focus on technology and innovation, aiming to become a tech hub for the continent. Women have a powerful voice in the new Rwanda. In fact, the Rwandan parliament has the highest percentage of women of any country in the world. It's a nation that is looking forward, determined not to be defined by its darkest days, but by its incredible progress. Of course, the scars of 1994 are still there. You cannot erase a tragedy that deep, but the hope for Rwanda's future is real, and it is powerful. The younger generation is growing up with a strong sense of national identity, as Rwandans first and foremost. They are taught about the past to ensure it never happens again, but they are also inspired to build a better future. Rwanda's journey is a powerful lesson for the whole world. It shows that even after the deepest darkness, it is possible to find light, to choose unity over division, and to rebuild not just buildings, but the very soul of a nation.